Hey, welcome to the video. Today we'll show you how to create a Windows executable from your Python project. There's two ways of doing that. One, you can package it as a folder, which is the first thing we'll be looking at, and then you can package it as one file. That's a little bit trickier, a bit more buggy, so we'll start with a folder and then move on to the file. This is the sixth video in a series of 6 built around our backup app, where we show you tips and tricks and lessons learned. If you haven't seen the other videos, please check them out. The first thing we'll do though is we'll go to a step-by-step guide, a cheat sheet if you like, of how to create this Windows executable. Check it out.
So to create a exe file for Windows for our backup app, we actually came across quite a few issues and bugs that needed fixing. So we are bringing together in this video all the lessons learned and the tips and tricks from our investigations there. So we'll come across a few bugs. The first ones have to do with there being incompatible versions of Python, Kivy, and PyInstaller. The second type of bug we've seen is a recursion error, or something that says you've reached maximum depth, and we'll talk about that in detail. And then the third one is a ModuleNotFound error. So these are the errors we came across to create a one folder exe solution. Actually, to create the one file, there's a few more that we need to fix, and at the time of recording this video, we are still fixing that. So the first thing to do is to make sure you install the right version of Python. The latest version available at the time of recording the video was 3.11. So when I installed Python, it was version 3.11 and then nothing worked. Now, I should have known better, because looking at the Kivy documentation in the screenshot below, you see that Kivy 2.1.0, which is the version I am using, only supports versions of Python between 3.7 and 3.10. So please make sure you are using a version of Python that works. Once you have the correct version of Python, we can then update our py file. So there's a number of things we need to change in our Python file. The first thing is you need to import the resource add path, and I'll show you in detail how to do that. Then in the app class, we need to create a separate function called resource path. So that function will then replace all the relative path references in our Python file. And lastly, we need to add this underscore may pass thing to resource path, and we'll talk about what that is and why it's there. Once the Python file has been updated, we also need to update the Kivy file. Again, we're going to use this function, this resource path function that we've written in our app class. We're going to use that to replace the relative path references in our Kivy file. And you do that by, as usual, calling app.resourcePath. Once that's all done, you can copy your files into a separate folder. So create a separate folder, the exe folder. This is a folder in which you will create your exe file, okay? And you copy all the files in there. So that's your Python files, your Kivy files, your images, anything, your databases, anything that your program or your app refers to needs to be copied into that folder. Once that's done, we can install PyInstaller, but you do need to install it correctly. Now, the correct way of doing that is you need to create a virtual environment first. Then you need to activate that virtual environment. You then need to install the correct version of PyInstaller. And at the time of recording, there is a version 5.7 of PyInstaller, but that does not work with Kivy. So for Kivy, you need to use 5.6.2. There's a particular part that doesn't work, and we will dig into which part that is. But just to be safe, I would install version 5.6.2 of PyInstaller. If not, you can get a recursion error. And then you can check the correct version with pip freeze. I will show you how to do that as well. Once installed, you can run PyInstaller. Now this has to happen with the virtual environment active. Then you move from within your virtual environment, you move to your exe folder, you run PyInstaller. This is where you choose to go for one folder or one file. I would highly recommend we do one folder first, fix all the bugs you will come across, and then move on to one file, because one file usually creates another set of bugs. Okay, PyInstaller creates a spec file that needs to be updated Again, this depends on whether it's a one folder or a one file option, but we'll show you both. Then you need to compile or recompile the spec file, and then you can run your app. And most likely you will come across a bug because the app that we've built, our backup app, doesn't do the same thing as yours. So you might have bits that create bugs that we haven't seen. Okay, so in that case, you fix the bug and go back to step 2, run PyInstaller, update the spec file, and compile the spec file again. Now that should then result in a folder that has your executable in there. I'll show you where it sits. It sits in the dist folder, and it's probably called main.py. It's whatever the name of your Python file was. So you can, in that folder, in the dist folder, subfolder if you like, you create a shortcut to main.py. Then you move that shortcut to the exe folder, and then rename that shortcut to something user-friendly, because this is what your user will be clicking on. Okay. Then you can delete all the files, except the shortcut clearly, but all the files in the exe folder you can then delete. And you can also delete the build folder, because that's just really there to build the exe file. Once it's been built, it doesn't need that anymore. But clearly do not delete the dist folder, because this is where your main.py file still lives. Okay, so that should give you something you can share with your customers. Now let's dig into the detail. So let's go through this step by step. The first thing to do is to install the right version of Python. Now I've set up this little text file. I know it looks ugly, I apologize, but I recommend that you do the same thing, because you might have to go through this a number of times, and it just makes sense to have all the commands that you could possibly need in one file. There's also quite a few links in the description of this video that will take you through the individual components if you need a bit more help. So the first thing to do is to find the right version of Python. For me, that was 3.10.6, and I am on my wife's Windows laptop. Don't tell her, she doesn't know. Because I don't use Windows, I'm a Linux user for reasons we can discuss some other time. But so we go to the python.org website, downloads Windows, and then find 3.10.6. So this is the python.org website, and if we then find 3.10.6, it's down here. So that is the version I've downloaded. So please read the note here that it cannot be used on Windows 7 or earlier, but I'm on Windows 10, so that shouldn't be a problem. Download that and just install that in the usual way. Once you've got Python installed, we're going to create a virtual environment. And again, in the description, there's a link that goes into more detail about exactly how that works and what it is. But these are the instructions that you will need. The first thing you will need to do is to update or upgrade your pip, your setup tools, and your virtual environment. So in the command line, so the way you open that is in here, you type cmd, right? If you type cmd, it opens up the command prompt. So in there, let's install that. So for me, it says this requirement's already satisfied because I've already done this before. So this means I have upgraded these tools. Now I'm going to use the virtual environment tool to create my virtual environment. And the way I do that is by this instruction here. From virtual environment, I'm going to use this tool to create a virtual environment called VNV, which is going to sit in this directory here. Okay, so that's been created. Now, don't forget to activate this. And on Windows, the instruction to activate your virtual environment is this one here. This is different on Linux, but on Windows, this is how you activate that. And the way you then see that is that in brackets, you've got the name of your virtual environment here. So this means your virtual environment is activated. So once your virtual environment has been activated, you need to upgrade a number of tools for PyInstaller to work. So the tools to upgrade are docutils, pigments, PyPyWin32, Kivy deps SDL2, and Kivy deps glue. So these are Kivy dependencies that we will need. So the way to do that is through this statement. Okay. Now once this has been updated, you can then install Kivy. You can either install Kivy base, which is just the base version, and the documentation for which there is a link in the description has more information around what these different versions are. But the base version is exactly that. It's just the basic stuff. Or you can install a full version. Now, the main difference, as far as I can tell, is if you have audio and video in your app, so basically if you're doing games or anything like that, you are better off with the full version because that will then install all the dependencies that you need. My app doesn't have that, so I've just installed this version of Kivy. So that would be the instruction to install Kivy. Okay, now I'm not going to reinstall that because I've already installed it. Now, once you've installed Kivy, you can then install PyInstaller, and those are the instructions here. So if you have 5.7, which at the moment does not work with Kivy 2.1.0, then you can uninstall PyInstaller with this line of code, and then you can install PyInstaller version 5.6.2 using this line of code. You also need to install these hooks. Once you've done that, you can then run the pip freeze command, which shows you what has been installed. For example, if I run pip freeze now, it will tell me what's installed. So Kivy depths have been installed, and pigments and PyPy Win32 and so on. You remember that was the previous statement. I didn't click install Kivy, so you won't see the version of Kivy, and I haven't installed PyInstaller, so you won't see that. But if you do install that, it will show you that you've installed PyInstaller version 5.6.2. Now, when all that's installed, you are ready to go into your Python app and start making some changes to the app. So in our overview, in our cheat sheet, if you like, we told you there were 4 changes to make. First change to make was an import statement. So at the very top of the app, you have all your usual Kivy imports. To create an executable, you're going to have to import OS and sys if you haven't already used them anyway. And then you will have to import from Kivy resources, import resource add path. The second point was to create a function resource path in the app class. So this is my app class, and this is maybe a good time to explain things in a little bit more detail about what it is that we're doing. So this resource path function, that's here. So we'll come back to that in a second. But I've written some blurb here about what is actually happening. So when PyInstaller is run, as in when you have your executable and your executable is executed, PyInstaller creates a separate directory, which is this underscore maypass thing, in which it will then put files it needs to effectively run your app in a little Python environment. Okay, so the logic here is the system will check whether this mypass directory exists. If it does, then it knows that actually this is PyInstaller running, and it needs to start looking for files in that directory. If that directory doesn't exist, then it doesn't need to go look there. It just looks at what you have coded in your app in terms of relative references or path references. So in the spec file, that's a point we mentioned as well in our cheat sheet, we will have to make some changes to the spec file for this to all work, but we'll come back to that later. So if this mypass thing isn't there, then we just want to use the relative path that the code was using, but we want to use an absolute path, right? Because if the maypass thing exists, we refer to this as in an absolute path manner, if you like. The references in our Python and Kivy code are relative path references. So what we then do is we can create an absolute path based on the relative path that we've entered. And this is what this function is going to do. Now we can do that by using the dot representation, which stands for the current directory. Okay, once we have done that, then we need to go into our code, and everywhere where we have a relative reference to a file, we need to change that to an absolute reference by using this resource path function. Okay, we need to do that in Python, and we need to do that in the Kivy file. This resource path function is what I'm talking about. So the input into it is our relative path, and it returns an absolute path. So it's going to try and see if this maypass thing exists. If this exists, then it will use that as the base path, because that's when PyInstaller will be putting all the files. If it doesn't exist, then this is the case, for example, if I just click run here in the existing Python environment, then it will just use the path that I have given, but it will create an absolute path for that, and then it will return the join of the base path and the relative path. In other words, it will then return an absolute path, either looking at the mypass directory or looking at the current directory. Here it takes the current directory, which is represented by a dot. It then turns that into an absolute path. Okay, so it creates a path of that using the os.path functionality. So my base path is either this one or it is just the current directory, okay? And then that gets joined with the relative path to form an absolute path. So that's what this function is doing. The next step is to go into the Python code and the Kivy code and replace every relative path reference by this function. A first example is up here, where this is what initially the code said. So it returns the builder load file, and it said that. So GUI.kv, that is a relative path. It means GUI sits in the same directory as the main.py file. So I'm going to replace that with this here. So I'm in my app class, so I can call self. From self, I call the resource path function and apply that to my relative reference. Okay, so that's one example. And within the app class itself, there's another example up here in one of the screens where I opened the file called instruction.txt. So this is what was there originally. And then what I do instead of just instructions.txt, so I replace that with the resource path function applied to instructions.txt, and this resource path function sits in the backup app. I have another example up here where I use the os.path.join functionality because this dir2 file sits in a files subdirectory. So I used os.path.join to join these two together to create a relative path. Now I'm going to keep doing that, but I'm going to then apply the resource path function to that. And the resource path function, I need to call that from the backup app because I'm not in the backup app. I am not in the backup app class. I'm in a different class. Now let's have a look at the changes we need to make to our Kivy file. It's going to be exactly the same. So for example, up here, the source of this image was files.etsyshopbanner.png. All I have to do now is apply the resource path function to that. Now this resource path function lives in the app class, and the way I get access to that in Kivy or in the Kivy file is by calling the app object. So once we've made that change in the Kivy file for our relative path, there is one final change we need to make in our Python file. And for that, I need to scroll all the way to the bottom in this if name equals main statement. You need to add this piece of code to create an executable with PyInstaller. And you will by now understand what this is doing. If the system has the mypass attribute, which means PyInstaller is unpacking the app and the app is running, then you need to add to the resource path this system.mypass attribute. So what it's saying is this mypass attribute, this folder, needs to be added to the resource path such that Python and PyInstaller have access to it. Okay, if the attribute isn't there, which means if we run this normally, for example, if we click run here, okay, then this mypass thing doesn't exist, and then there is no need to add that folder to the resource path. The next thing to do is to set up a new folder to store our executable. So I've just created a subdirectory called exe files. In there I've created a directory called my app, and I've copied all the files I need from my Python app. So for my Python app, I have the main file, I have backup functions, and then I have a number of files that I am using: backup log, backup release, and so on. The GUI file, an instructions file, and a most recent backup file. The only file that is added to that is an icon file. I want my app to have a little icon so that looks a bit more professional. Once I've copied all the files into there, I'm ready to run my PyInstaller instruction. So to run our PyInstaller instruction, we need to be in our virtual environment. Okay, so I am in my PyCharm terminal. You could be in your command line where you have created and activated your virtual environment. Remember, you can then see the name of the virtual environment in brackets. So this is the virtual environment in which I have installed Kivy and PyInstaller and everything I need. Now, the trick is from within this virtual environment to go to your folder that you have just created to store all your files in. So with this instruction, I end up in my folder. So it's my exe files and my app. Okay, so this will of course be different for you. It depends on your file structure and where you have created this folder to put your files into. Once you are in there, you can run your PyInstaller instruction. So the basic PyInstaller instruction to run a one folder solution is this one. So PyInstaller -w means windowed version. Come back to that in a second. You can add an icon. So this is the icon file I have copied into my directory. So I used the --icon option, and I also used the debug equals all option because I want to see if there's any errors. And then the file that I want to run PyInstaller on is the main.py file. Now this windowed option is what's creating the issues with PyInstaller 5.7 and Kivy 2.1.0. So the windowed option is one that I would recommend because it makes it easier to read bugs. If you don't use the windowed option and you click your app and there are bugs, it will just give you a list of gobbledygook, or actually you won't be able to read the list because it scrolls so quickly through all the errors. If you use the windowed version, you can actually read the bug, so I think it's essential. Now, if you want to use the windowed version, you have to use PyInstaller 5.6.2 with Kivy 2.1.0. If you use 5.7, you will get a recursion error. Okay, the reason for that, and there's a link in the description from GitHub where it shows the Kivy issues. It's issue 8074. What effectively happens is Kivy runs a logger, and this is not an issue if you don't run PyInstaller. So if you just run your app in your PyCharm or whichever IDE you are using, this will not cause you an issue. It's only when PyInstaller is being used, because in 5.7, PyInstaller no longer creates a fake system standard out and system standard error, which is a feature that this windowed option needs. Now, Kivy, apparently, the Kivy logger just writes to this system standard error without first checking that it actually exists, and therefore PyInstaller think this is a Kivy bug and Kivy think this is a PyInstaller bug. Either way, there's two solutions to this problem. One, you can either not run the windowed option, but for me that doesn't work because then I can't read the bugs, or you use version 5.6.2. Right, so all that to explain, this is why I think you should use version 5.6.2 of PyInstaller. Right, there we go. Now, after all that, we can now finally run our PyInstaller instruction. Now, this will take a few seconds, and it will actually give me an error. Well, this code will run to completion. It will say everything has worked successfully, but then I can show you that actually it did not. Okay, so according to the messages here, this has completed successfully, but I'll show you that it did not. So where does this file now live? Well, it's in the My App directory. This is where we copied all the files. What you will see is there's now a build directory, there's a dist directory, and there's an extra file here, main. It's a spec file. We'll come back to this one in a second. So the main file lives in dist main. Okay, let's find the main file in here. If I click on it, you'll find that it will give me some errors. Now, this will never work anyway because the next step in the process was to update the spec file. But this will give you an idea of why, because it's saying that there's no such file called GUI.kv, and I go, well, actually there is, because I copied that into the directory. Right, so if I look at this directory, well, it's right here. We need to update the spec file so that PyInstaller knows where all these files are and can connect to it. So let's go back to my notes. This is the main.spec file. This is what the system has created. So we need to make a few changes. The first thing to do is to put an import statement at the top. So I said to the very top, we need to import these dependencies SDL2 and glue. So you might remember those from earlier when we updated the dependencies. Now, if you have audio and video, you need to add two more. One of them is GL Streamer, and that's explained in the Kivy documentation. And I've put a link in the description to get you that. So you can just copy the names of the packages that you need from there. But I don't need that, so I just import those two. Now, under A and above PYZ, so there's A here and there's PYZ, so just create a bit of space there. You need to add all the data files. So this is explained in the PyInstaller documentation, and again I've added links in the description to that. So for every file that you use, you need to add that file to the datas list. Now I've done every file individually here, which is a bit of a long way around. You can do this in one go, but just for clarity and for my own sanity, to be honest. So you need to add every file that your Python program and Kivy program needs. So remember, these are the files that you've copied into your executable folder. What it's telling PyInstaller is, PyInstaller, you need some data files, right? And in the code, they are referred to as this. So there is a files directory, and within that there is a file called dir_from, there is a file called dir2, there's a file called etsy-shop-banner.png, and there's a file called most recent backup.txt. Now, for PyInstaller, they sit somewhere else because I've copied them, I had to copy them into my XE folder. So I'm going to tell PyInstaller my XE folder is this one here. So let me move to the side a little bit. So that's clearly going to be different for you. It depends where you stuck it, but this is my XE files folder, my backup win1 file. Remember, this is the code I'm using for my actual backup app. So in the example, this would have been my app, okay? And then there is a file called dir_from. So you're basically mapping or telling PyInstaller how to map the relative references it finds in the code to where that file now actually sits. Okay, don't forget to add data to that because this is a data file. Okay, and there's no comma behind this. Okay, right? So then we have to do that for every file. So you can see that this is the same, except that the file name changes, right? There you go, there you go, there you go. And they're all data files. Now the thing to understand is this is Windows. Okay, so in Windows you will need double backslashes. The reason for that is that one backslash is actually defines a special character, so you need the second one to undo that. So this is just Windows. You don't need that for Mac or for Linux. So you need to put double backslashes everywhere instead of single backslashes. Okay, so this is double backslashes, except for the Kivy file name. So the Kivy file name I've added separately. So my GUI.kv, that sits in that same folder. Okay, but whereas here I had double backslashes and here before the file name, that is not the case for the KV file. Now, I have tried to find out why that is. I don't know why this is. It annoys me slightly that I don't know why. Actually, it annoys me a lot that I don't know why this is. But just remember that for the Kivy file, you only use one backslash. Okay, so that's adding the data files. So let's change the file for that. So I've done the import. So what did I say? Under A and above PYZ. So I'm going to copy all this. Of course, you don't need to copy the comments across if you don't want to. Okay, then there's one final change we need to make. You see there's two more sections. There's an XE section and a col section. If you are doing the one folder option, you're going to have to change the collect part of it. We'll see later that if you want to do the one file, you're going to need to change the XE section. But for now, we're doing one folder. So you need to add this tree object behind the exe statement. I've put a link in the description to explain what that tree object is. And then you need to add this statement as well. So you use a tree to build up a tree object, basically. So this is where PyInstaller can look for files, and you add the SDL2 dependencies and the glue dependency. So those two are the ones that we imported at the very top. Now, don't forget the comma behind here, because as you can see, where we're going to have to stick this is behind the a.datas. So a.datas is here. There's more stuff following there. Okay, so you need to, there's a comma and then there's more stuff. Now, if we're going to add things to here, we need to add a comma at the end. So what I tend to do is just copy the whole thing from the end of a all the way to the call bit. Copy that in, and there you go. That's that. So those are the changes we have to make. We now need to save it, and then of course we need to recompile this spec file. Okay, let's see what that does. So we've saved it. Let's recompile. And how do we recompile? We recompile by doing PyInstaller main.spec-y. So I'm now back in my PyCharm environment, and crucially I'm in my virtual environment, and I'm in my app folder, and I run that. Right, completed successfully. So now it has recompiled my spec file. Let's see if my app works now. Okay, let's go to my app. In my dist folder, let's find the main file, run it, and I get errors. Now, I knew there was errors, but this is what you will find. Okay, and the other thing to add, if you don't do the Windows option, right, you won't get this block of text. You will get a black screen with all sorts of text running through it, and you can't actually read it. This is why I would urge you to use the Windows option. Okay, now the last line tells me there's a module it cannot find. Now, Win32 time zone is not a module I imported, all my import statements. So this is clearly a module it needs, but that is not imported through the normal way. So that makes it a hidden import. Again, in the description, there is some explanation around this. But if you find this type of error, it usually means it's a hidden import. So what you need to do is you need to change your statement, your PyInstaller statement. So let's go back to the PyInstaller statement, and we need to add hidden import. I'm going to rerun it with hidden import. So this is just a dash hidden import, the name of the module that was missing, and everything else stays the same. So if I run that, okay, successfully. Now remember, this still won't work because we have to update the spec file first. So we just do the same thing. We add the import statement to start with at the very top. We then add all our data stuff, and that is, remember, that is between the A and the PYZ. So that's here. We add the data stuff, and this is why I recommend you store this in a file, because you might end up doing this a number of times. And for the one folder option, we change the collect piece. So collect, remember the comma at the end, everything from A-datas back, replace that. Okay, that's updated. Save that file, close it, then recompile. Recompile the main spec. Completed successfully. Let's have a look. So my app, go to dist, main, find the main file, run it. And there you go. This is my app. So I can take a backup, go back, clear backup logs. So help file, yeah, this all works. There you go. So this is my solution. Now, the next thing to do is to clean up this directory, because there's a lot of clutter in there that we don't really need. So how can we declutter this? Well, the first thing I would do, as we said in the cheat sheet, you go to dist and main, you find the main file. Now I would create a shortcut of this file. Okay, I create a shortcut, and this shortcut I would then copy to the main directory here. And then I would give this shortcut a name, which is, in my case, simple backup app. Why do I do that? Well, this is what ultimately we want the user to go to. Now, the user sees all these files as well, and they don't really need to, okay, because they have this shortcut to go through the main app. Now, there is an outstanding issue with PyInstaller where users have asked for this to be cleaned up automatically. At the moment, this is not the case. So, the thing to do is you can delete the build folder. There's an awful lot of stuff in the build folder. This is really just there to build the app. So once it's built, it doesn't need that anymore. So you can delete that. The dist folder you cannot delete. This is of course where your main file lives. Remember, in dist main, this is where your main file lives. Okay, and that's what your shortcut refers to. So you don't touch that. But all the other things here, these are just files that you copied in originally that PyInstaller used to build your app, and now it doesn't need that anymore because now it's all in the dist folder. So you can delete everything here except the shortcut. So you can delete all that. Now let's check it still works. So you double click the shortcut and there you go. This is my app. I can still use it as intended. Okay. Now what you can then do is you can package this directory, you can zip it, send it to your clients, ask them to unzip it, and all they have to do is click the simple backup app or the shortcut you have created for the app to run. Now the next step is to do this as one file. Now the process is exactly the same for one file. The instructions are slightly different. So let me talk you through that. So the instructions for one file are very similar. Actually, they are the same. You just need to add an extra option that says -- one file. Everything else stays the same. Once you then do that, you will then have to update your spec file as before. Now, the import bit stays the same. The adding of the data files, including your GUI file or your Kivy file, is exactly the same. But the difference is what you change in your spec file. Now, for the one folder, we updated the call bit. For the one file, we update the exe bit. So that's this bit here. Now, this is very similar. You add the tree bit here in the first line after this here. Don't forget the comma. And then you add the -tree statement here, which does the same thing after the data piece. So again, here you can just copy all that, but instead of replacing call, you replace the exe. And that should be it for the spec file for your one file option. You then recompile the spec file as before, as we have done before. So that is this statement here, and then that could work. In my case, it doesn't. I have an error, and we are at the moment still looking into that. We've been looking into it for a little while. It has something to do with DLLs. I hope you don't come across that one because Google has nothing on it. If I ever find a solution, I will post an update to that. But for now, this is where we are. Hope you found that helpful and useful. If you did, please like the video or leave a comment. Thanks for your time. See you soon. Bye.